wellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
You're listening to A Quirky Journey, the healthy family podcast with your hosts Jo Whitten and Fuad Kassab. Welcome to A Quirky Journey. Join us as we share our family's journeys to good health. You'll find plenty of inspiration, tips and recipe ideas, as well as stories from everyday people who've struggled and overcome health problems and diet challenges in their own families. Today I have with me Fuad. Hi Fuad.
Hi Jo.
And we have Dr. Igor again. So thank you for coming again, Igor.
Hello again.
How are you?
Hi Dr. T.
Hi.
We're pretty excited because we had such a great time last time you came and chatted with us, and we had so much feedback from people saying that was very helpful and they want to know more. So we thought we'd get you back and ask you lots of questions about food allergies and reactions to food, because this is a much more complicated subject than it seems, and I think you have a lot to share with us on this. So maybe we can just hand it over to you and you can talk. We'll ask you questions.
Well, just to start off, I think with our context, like what we're looking at here, and a lot of the people that follow Jo on her Facebook page and her website, they come from a background of food allergies.
Yeah.
And a lot of people try to find this like silver bullet, Dr. T, where they go, this is the reason for my allergies. This is like, people have messed around with food and it's all GMO, or some people say like antibiotics, and some people say it's this or that, and everyone starts going, no, of course, studies show that this has a contributing factor, and everyone's really confused and lost, and they don't know what to trust, and everyone really tries to pin down the source of their disease to one thing. So is there one cause, or do we have many causes, and what's the most prevalent or relevant to us?
Well, I think the broader case of reactions to food, I'm going to outline how broad that actually is, because it isn't all allergy, and sometimes we have to speak the same language even though we're trying to get the same message across, what we're actually talking about. So I'm going to try to give you a broad range of how we react to food, not just the additives that have been put in there as a result of, flavor enhancing and preservatives and things like that. Mm-hmm. Just naturally cooking some food creates issues with it. So I guess I'll sort of start with some examples. So in last year, there was a case of a mother and daughter who died in Bali from anaphylactic shock from eating fish in Bali.
Yeah.
And it was actually quite a common disorder, even though ABC never mentioned the technical name for it, but it's actually called scombroid, SCOMBROID. Mm-hmm. And it's to do with, we'll come back to it, but basically what they love fish. They were from the Sunshine Coast. They went up to Bali. They had lots of their favourite fish, and perhaps some fish that might have been out too long. The climate there, things can go off more quickly.
Yeah.
And it's actually a global issue. The WHO actually keep an eye on the level of histamine in the fish. So it's not added to it. It's not an ingredient that's added to food as such. But some foods are naturally higher in amines. You probably might have come across that word if you looked at the RPA and Swain's work. There's some foods are higher in amines. And the thing about these amines is that some people are better at handling them than others. And why these people died was that they both had asthma and they were on chronic antihistamines. So I'll keep going with that one, because it's an important thing to know that wasn't anybody's fault as such, even though globally we know that some fish in particular have higher levels of histamine or amines. But it's also a characteristic of food that's been left out for a long time, or leftovers that have been reheated the next day. And I think in some ways the refrigerator and the freezer are a retrograde step, because they've encouraged us to eat that kind of food and perhaps make more food than we should be eating at the time. Now for some people histamine doesn't seem to bother them, and there seems to be two categories of people. You're either histodelic, which is you have high histamine levels or histopenic, low histamine levels. And because histamine has so many functions in the body, I'll give you some examples. Histamine is important for the sleep-wake cycle because it promotes wakefulness. It's important for controlling the body temperature, appetite, cognition, the state of the blood vessels, in the lung, in the peripheral part of the body. It's involved in gastric secretions. There's a whole range of things that histamine does. So it's supposed to be there. And normally, it's the liver that controls the circulating histamine. It's kind of the monitor, the school monitor that's controlling histamine. Some people are very good at keeping histamine levels down, and some people are not. So if your diet is high in histamines and you happen to be unlucky that your liver is not very good at dealing with histamines or amines, and then you get a challenge like that with a whacking dose of histamine, and you happen to have atopic asthma, which is the histamine-based type asthma, then you're the one that's going to go on to a really severe reaction. And in fact, in peanut allergy, I believe that most of the deaths that are related to peanut allergy were always in asthmatic people.
Wow.
It's very unlikely to die from peanut anaphylaxis if you don't actually have asthma pre-existing. So often these reactions are either something that's happened historically, or something you've been perhaps set up for a particular reaction given perhaps genetics, and then there's something else that happens. There's never just one thing that, in terms of these histamine reactions. Having said that, 5 people per year die from eating, the blowfish, the pufferfish, fugu in Japan. And that's because it contains a toxin that no one is immune to. It just paralyzes your nerves and you die. And in Japan, they eat that fish regularly. You have to do a course that lasts for 3 years to show you're proficient at filleting it and removing the toxic parts of it. And even then, they still have accidents where people will die.
That's just crazy.
I know. It's just you just think, well, what
a gamble.
So why is it so yummy? I mean, they eat the ovaries and all sorts of things there. Yeah. But so
I looked into that for a while. It was from what I understand, they were eating the organs. Like if you eat the flesh, that's usually okay. But the thing that most people really, really crave and love is having a bit of that flesh with the liver, because apparently texturally it's just quite sublime. And a lot of people will overeat. Like if they have a bit more than their body can handle, the toxicity that's in the liver just sends them over the edge. That's from what I've read.
Crazy.
But and that meat itself isn't really worth eating. Yeah,
that's what certain things about food. If you think about this, let's say a tribe goes into a new jungle and they start eating things at random. Eventually, they're going to find out the hard way that some of those things are toxic.
Yeah.
Perhaps the taste buds of some of those people will save them and give them a survival advantage, because they can either have a higher tolerance for certain toxins, like for mushrooms or other toxins we find in plants, or they'll be able to taste the toxin and avoid it. The ones that don't obviously won't reprocreate, and that will be the end of their genetic line. Yeah. So the taste and reactions actually has some survival advantage, believe it or not. I'll give you an example, and you'll like this. 10 humans, 10 cats, and 10 dogs, and 10 rats managed to get themselves into the Willy Wonka chocolate factory.
Okay.
And they all pig out, and only the humans survive.
Yep.
And that's because those animals don't have the liver enzymes to deal with the theobromine that is natural in chocolate. So that's not added to chocolate. Willy Wonka would never add additives to his chocolate. It's just that there's a certain tolerance for these things that occur naturally. And another interesting example is kidney beans. I don't know if you realise this, but 5 raw kidney beans is actually a fatal dose.
Wow.
Yeah.
What?
It's a compound in the kidney beans that makes your blood clot. They're called hemagglutination units.
Wow.
And if you don't soak them and boil them, you have more of these toxins. and it's considered, 4 or 5 raw kidney beans will initiate nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. It could actually be fatal in some people. Wow. So that's just a natural effect of the food, and everyone has a tolerance for that. The other one is, how potatoes turn green.
Yeah.
Well, that's due to a compound. It's actually due to chlorophyll being made in the potato, which is saying, can you get me into the sunlight because I really want to sprout? Yeah. But they have a compound in there called solanine, and 225 to 450 milligrams of potatoes that have this green colour is actually fatal. Wow. That's about 1 kilogram. So if you ate 1 kilogram of potatoes that have gone green, you could be looking at a fatal reaction for that.
Even if it's cooked?
Well, the thing is, if you peel the skin off, it's okay. It's the problem in the skin. But that's where all the vitamin C is, by the way.
Yeah.
But, so you can, and so maybe the lesson to that is moderation.
Yeah.
That no one would.
Like 2 raw kidney beans instead of 5.
If you're going to chew on kidney beans.
So there's the social aspect to that these things, if they're shared, you don't get the toxic reactions. So you see those food reactions, that's nothing that they're not to do with anything to do related to the GMO or how they're prepared. Or
would you call that an allergy?
No, they're not. And that's the thing sometimes when people get confused, that they don't. We tend to use allergy and intolerance in the same breath, and they're not necessarily the same thing. For most of these foods, I think everybody's intolerant. Salicylates are a very good group, a good example of this, because if you took a chili, for instance, which is loaded with salicylates, and admittedly there's capsaicin, rosmarinic acid, and a few other things in there as well, but if you got 100 people randomly and said, how much red chili could you eat? Some people couldn't have any. Some people could have a tip, a quarter, a half, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a spectrum of the intolerance of it. Same with alcohol. Everything that's produced has a certain tolerance to it.
I don't want to jump ahead of myself here. You might be getting there, but what about gluten? Does that go on a spectrum as well? Or is celiac the only way that you'd be intolerant to gluten?
Well, technically, celiac. See, sometimes we're trying to use older terminology for something that's new. So the celiac was a clinical diagnosis. It was about 1 in 10,000 people. They were underweight, had terrible diarrhea if they ever had any type of gluten, and they had that from birth. And there are genes for this disorder. But about maybe 1 in 10 people have reactions to gluten, which is not celiac. But they may have the same type of antibodies. So we're using that test in a different way. It's the same with the anti-nuclear antibodies. They were invented for diagnosing a condition called systemic lupus erythematosus. But many people have the same antibodies and don't have that disorder. So medicine has to kind of recalculate, re-pigeonhole some of these things so we can understand them better. But coming back to your question about gluten, because it's for agglutinating, is deliberately sticky, and it's a really hard thing to digest. You need lots of stomach acid to start the denaturing of it. You need lots of intestinal enzymes to denature it. Everything's got to be working absolutely hunky-dory. And for most people, that doesn't cause a problem. I suppose the gluten gets digested, causes a little bit of leaky gut, but by the time the gluten fragments have got to that part of the intestine that's leaky, there's nothing to set off an immune reaction because they're perfectly neutral. Like if you took gluten apart, about 60% glutamine, amino acid, and a few other amino acids, and they're all in their inert, safe form. But it's actually an aspect of digestion that most people don't realise, that if you, let's say you blended up your dinner in the thermos 14,000 RPM for, a couple of hours, and then you put that into a syringe and injected it into a vein, you'd be dead before you put a mill in because of you'd have an anaphylactic reaction, because none of that food is supposed to bypass the intestine. None of it. Which brings me to my next point, which is a condition where people, after being bitten by a tick, cannot eat meat anymore. Can't eat beef, pork, and it's called the Lone Star tick. And discovered in 2007, these people had been bitten by this tick forevermore, could not eat meat, red meat. Gee. And it wasn't anything that had been done to the meat. It was the fact that normally the proteins and constituents of proteins in animals, we're hidden from them. They're destroyed either by the stomach acid, which is why the pH is 2 and so erosive, or the intestine has destroyed them, or our bugs in the intestine have destroyed those toxins, or they haven't got past the intestinal border, or the liver has caught them and they've never ever got into systemic circulation. So there are several wicket keepers that stop these things from getting through. So very few times does something from a food ever get directly into the bloodstream. But the tick injects this compound called alpha-gal, which is found in those species of animals. So it's a direct, I suppose, vaccination against those particular compounds, which would never get into the bloodstream. And so forevermore, those people can't eat red meat. They can eat chicken and turkey.
So let me get this straight. So the tick actually puts that compound in your bloodstream, then your immune system reacts to that and mounts an attack. And then whenever you eat red meat, it starts going through that kind of immune response.
Because it's exactly right. It's like you're pre-sensitized.
Wow.
See, normally those compounds don't get into the bloodstream. Now, this is where gluten and a whole lot of these other issues come into effect, because normally the fragments, a couple of amino acid fragments together, they shouldn't get into the systemic circulation at all to cause a reaction. You see, and those reactions are not allergy mediated. They're mediated through the same mechanism as you would if you had a virus. And that's where the terminology needs to be standardized. When doctors talk about allergies, they're talking about IgE, immunoglobulin E, which is mostly a histamine-based reaction.
Yes.
So there's a trigger, and then these lymphocytes release masses of histamine, which then basically causes a severe asthma attack and drops your blood pressure to zero.
So that is an allergic response as opposed to immune response.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
And those tests are mediated. Most immunologists check those through IgE.
Yeah.
But the reactions to gluten and the tick bite and a whole lot of other foods are mediated through a completely different part of the immune system. It's IgG, immunoglobulin G. And they aren't allergies.
Okay.
You see,
they're just as dangerous.
Are they immune? They're immune responses. So is that what we're saying?
And there's a whole spectrum of them, and I guess it depends on the circumstances. So that's where you get this cross-reactivity.
So this is what, like white blood cells get made and start attacking is that what's happening? There's an inflammatory response. Is that
there's lymphocytes that are charged with storing the face of the enemy, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so anything that looks a little bit odd, if it's seen it before, there's a certain reaction. It's the IgG. If it hasn't seen it before, it's called IgM. It's kind of like a tank. It mobilized quickly, but it's not that maneuverable.
Yeah.
And so you get these different phases. Like, say you have a virus, and they'll say, "Oh, you've got glandular fever at the moment." That's because your immunoglobulin M for that virus has been detected. And then when the body finds a more efficient way to do it, instead of driving tanks through the bloodstream, they've just got these handguns, which is IgG. Later, the IgG rises, and then they'll say, "Oh, you had glandular fever before sometime. We can't tell exactly when." And you can get IgG reactions to any food. There are companies like HealthScope that do a 93-panel IgG food reactions from blood tests. which is completely different to what immunologists do when they check for allergies. Okay. And they're not quite the same thing. They come under food reactions and they're food triggers, but they are mediated differently. Now, the importance of this is that, if we remember our last podcast, some people's immune systems overdo these immune reactions. Instead of the dial going to 2 or 3 for a couple of days, they'll keep it on 10 for months. And it's these people that seem to have more issues with the food reactions if they're mediated through this IgG thing. So the leaky gut is very, very relevant. Gut health here predisposes them to reacting to foods, even things that you wouldn't expect. But there have to be a lot of defense systems down before that happens. Like the salicylates are a good example. They should be destroyed in the gut, in the stomach actually. The same as the pesticides and the flavor enhancers and the preservatives and the colorings and the flavors. When they were licensed, humans didn't have an issue with digestion like we have now. Very, very different kettle of fish. And the question we should be asking is, why are we reacting to these now and not originally when they came? And it's because our gut health is worse.
So people point to those things as the source of our disrupted gut health. Are you saying that, no, these are just now symptomatic because our gut health has deteriorated from other reasons?
No, the reactions to them are a consequence of poor gut health.
Okay, and where did the gut health
come?
There's a few reasons. One is that if you follow zinc levels in the community, if you look at things like the reference ranges for zinc, which are supposed to be in people who've been counselled to make sure they don't have any specific illnesses, you find that the zinc levels have fallen in the normal range quite substantially over the last 10, 12 years.
Right.
Same with selenium, chromium, all those trace elements. Now, the problem with zinc is that once it gets below a certain point, you can't make enough stomach acid. And if you don't have that stomach acid, you will not be able to destroy the colorings, flavors enhancers, and preservatives when they hit the stomach. Your defense to them is gone. So you're going to see more reactions to them. And then in the group of patients who have overactive immune systems, the combination of their deteriorating gut health, which then turns all their immune system into overdrive, plus their lack of protective mechanisms from these compounds, is why you're seeing a rise in reactions to foods and all those colorings and things like that. It's a combination of things. So
why do you think the gut health, why is the zinc low? Is it the soil depletion, or what is it?
There's a few reasons. It's the total amount of zinc in a person is determined by the amount coming in minus the amount going out. So the losses of zinc, 85%, is through the intestine. So if you've got intestinal issues, you will lose more zinc than you can put in. And once it gets below a certain point, you won't be able to catch up. So normally, if a nutrient falls, there's a whole range of catch-up reactions, endocrinological glands and the nervous system, and say, look, eat more of these foods. That's why we get cravings. You go through and they go, oh, I feel like almonds today. I don't know why. Why do I feel like almonds today? And it's your body taking over. It's the autonomic nervous system saying, right, well, we're low in magnesium and zinc, so I think you should eat more of these things. And so instinctively, animals do this. They will seek out what they need, and we're animals. And most of the time, we follow our intuition until our parents beat it out of us, of course. So as the zinc falls, we would naturally go to foods that have higher amounts of zinc. But there's a limit to how much zinc is in our food naturally, and it hasn't improved. There's no way it's improved. So that's why levels of zinc are generally falling, and that's why we're starting to get more issues with digestion. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're eating something. Let's say it's a combination, or let's just say it's breast milk. Normally what would happen is that when it gets to the stomach, the stomach drops the pH to 2 and starts digesting the proteins that are the larger ones. And then when the stomach empties and pushes the food to the next sort of area, the duodenum, then there has been a message from the stomach to the rest of the endocrine glands saying, oh, how much protein, how much sugar, how much fat is in this meal, how much pancreatic secretion should we make, what should the pH of that pancreatic secretion is, how alkaline would it need to be to neutralize how much acid we put in, all of these things. And then the next step is the proteins that have been mostly denatured from larger fragments to smaller ones. The intestine has, 8.5 meters and lots of time to just pick at it until it's all nicely digested by the time it gets absorbed further down. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole range of things that happen. A lot of them require zinc to make them. For instance, if you don't make enough stomach acid, this might delay the emptying of the stomach to the next phase. You see, and if that happens, then what may happen is that the milk will start to ferment, mm-hmm. which means that there will be pressure in the gut, and it might go up the wrong way.
Ah,
so you get reflux from that. Yeah.
Now, if you look at the prescribing of drugs for reflux,
oh my God,
they used to be in adults only, and then young adults, and then teens, and now we're prescribing them in infants.
Yeah.
Yeah,
now,
those proton pump inhibitors. Yeah.
And it's because if the mother's low in zinc, the baby's going to be low in zinc, and then you're going to get more of this digestive issues and peristalsis issues, you see. Wow.
So can you take zinc to improve it usually?
Yeah, normally we give it to the mums.
Okay.
You check in the mums. It's quite interesting because my patients are very, not guinea pigs, but they're very they want to do things for the bigger picture.
Yeah,
that's altruistic. So because normally we measure things like iron and pregnancy, mm-hmm. but it's very interesting to follow zinc during pregnancy. Mm. And I'm not the only one who's done this. There are studies to show that we should pay just as much attention to zinc as we do to calcium and folate and iron in pregnancy, because all the ones that I've checked, all the zinc levels are abysmally low by the time they deliver.
Wow.
Now, the implication of that, importance about zinc, is you need it to make serotonin. You need a really good level of zinc to make serotonin your happy chemical.
Yep.
And the thing about zinc is that there's a certain amount in the bloodstream. You've got 5 or 6 litres of blood, and there's there's some there, but you store some zinc at short call in muscle. So at day 3, when the letdown comes in for a mother, all the zinc goes into the breast milk because the zinc is needed for secretions, all the secretions. Mm. And breast milk has a significant amount of zinc in it for the baby's digestion, for their immune system, for growth, all these things. But it drops in the bloodstream. So what you'll find then is there will be some tissues, therefore, that don't have enough zinc, and one of them is the brain. Mm. And that's been one of the explanations for the 3-day blues postpartum. Ah. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
If you had lots and lots of zinc to spare, like you had good muscle mass, because it's the muscle that's mostly the short-term call for zinc. When you have an infection, it comes out of muscle. That's why the studies show that exercise and muscle mass improve immunity.
Huh.
So, Dr. T, just to go on the zinc idea for our listeners, it's not just zinc that we're talking about here that could have these kinds of symptoms or cause problems like this. So are you just giving zinc as an example?
The zinc is the commonest and the best example.
Okay, right, okay. But there could be other...
that the levels have fallen.
Yeah.
Even the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, realised this because they're the ones who control how much of these things you can buy over the counter. Mm. And for years and years and years, it was 25 milligrams or that sort of amount that you could buy over the counter. And recently they changed it to 50. Oh. Now, why would they do that if they weren't aware that perhaps the general population levels have fallen since the TGA was formed in 1989?
Yeah.
You see? So we see it clinically, and
so we're seeing all these, correlation. I mean, obviously, is quite clear that there's way more food intolerances and allergies and all these problems, and these levels have dropped. So this does sort of fall in place with the research that you were talking about.
Yeah, and perhaps we're noticing the greater intensity of these reactions.
Yeah.
Like we've all eaten something and thought, oh, I wish I hadn't eaten that. I remember when I lived in Hong Kong, seafood was in abundance there, and when somebody takes you out to dinner, it's kind of rude not to finish the whole thing if you buy a few kilograms of seafood. And I remember once eating more crab than I've ever eaten before, and the next day I had this very fine rash on me, and I thought, that's really interesting. I've eaten crab before, but I never ate this amount.
Yeah.
And it was exceeded some threshold in me.
I bet it was delicious, though.
Yeah, well, I was inspired to learn how to cook that Singapore chili crab.
It is delicious.
So then you've got these triggers, and then it's the extent of the reactions that people are noticing. And this is where, like, the dysbiosis, the gut bacteria imbalance, can make a huge difference to whether somebody just has a bit of a gut ache or they're sick for weeks or months after eating something they shouldn't have eaten. And we know that there's various reasons why the gut bacteria might not be optimal. The person might be a C-section baby. They may have had antibiotics early on in life. They maybe we're talking about the effect of herbicides in the destruction of the poisoning the mitochondria of these bacteria. Then you've got the processing of foods that generally lead to lower fiber intake or lead to dysbiosis. There's a whole range of reasons why someone would then have dysbiosis, and then if they're challenged, they react more intensely, even if it's eczema, for instance. And it's interesting, one of my patients came back with eczema that had been completely healed and said, my doctor put me on this product called Eczema Shield because he said the inflammation in the skin is somewhat dependent on the gut bacteria.
Yay!
And of course, the TGA had to be convinced of that, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to call it that. Which brings me to another point that, legally only doctors are allowed to call patients.
Oh.
And legally, no one is allowed to say that they cured anybody. The doctor says they cured somebody, they're liable to be reported by someone.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is interesting.
It is interesting. So, yeah, you have to be quite careful about how you speak about it.
What are you allowed to say? That you managed their disease? What do you say?
You managed, yes. Very good.
Oh,
very good spin on that one for us.
Oh, my God.
Dr.
T,
we managed it so that it wasn't a problem ever again.
So I've got a question. Maybe I'll get a freebie off you while we're here. May as well. Yeah. So I'll just give you a bit of background about myself very quickly and flesh out a few ideas that I've had since we last spoke, and also basically from the conversation that we're having now. But I grew up with a lot of infections in my early childhood. I had a lot of ear infections, and then I got a lot of skin infection. I got staphylococcus basically in my head, like at the base of my hair follicles, and then that spread out throughout my whole body. And then later on, I got eczema everywhere, and I would scratch until I bled all the time. And I saw so many allergy specialists, and everyone would put me on antibiotics and steroid creams. And then when I turned 30, I went on a gluten-free paleo diet, and all these things got better. And I'm wondering, is it the nutritional density of the paleo diet that I've restored? For instance, I started eating these foods that are richer in zinc, like oysters and things like that. Or is it the fact that I've cut out the gluten, or is it both? And what would you call what I had when I ate gluten? When I eat gluten now, I will get itchy again. I'll get eczema, and some acne will come back when I eat it now. Would you call that an immune response, or is it gluten? I don't even know. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It sounds like with once the process starts, I think you're probably low in zinc when you're a child.
Okay.
And so the run of infections are very typical of children who have had low zinc, they either get gastros or otitis media, those ear infections.
Yeah.
And there's that actually, University of Queensland did a study a few years ago where they gave these 2 to 6 year olds 15 milligrams of zinc, which is like the adult dose, and they dropped their presentations of ear infections and gastro and bronchitis to virtually nothing.
Wow.
That's been repeated all over the world.
Wow.
So it's more likely to get infections. So as soon as that starts, the natural tendency is to give an antibiotic for the infection, which then
the Lebanese
creates,
are antibiotic trigger happy, you know, like they'll just give you antibiotics.
And
like
then the dysbiosis begins, and probably at those through times you would have had fever, so you would have got either paracetamol, aspirin, or ibuprofen.
All the time. Yeah, all the time. Which
kills off the E. coli, which is the major aerobic bacteria in the intestine. So the combination of antipyretics, antibiotics set up a more serious reaction. And then when gluten comes along, as you know, everyone gets some leaky gut from the gluten, but if you have gluten more than once a day, you don't get a chance to repair it. So you get a chronic leaky gut.
The Lebanese invented bread, you know, they call it Lebanese bread.
They think they invented bread.
I know. But the funny thing is, like, you know, my mom would make me a Lebanese roll, and she would put like rice with noodles in it, you know. So you know, even that would be had with bread. We had it with everything.
Wow.
My mother's Lebanese, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
There you go.
Yeah. And so they have your Lebanese bread with za'atar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's good stuff. I love it.
For fillings, yeah, I know. I know what they're like. Yeah. So the gluten aspect of it then starts to perpetuate the problem. You perpetuate the malabsorption, so you can't absorb the things you need to heal the eczema. You know, things like proline and glycine, these things for the skin. Your immune system goes into high alert, so anything remotely like gluten sets it off, and that's because it's just a survival advantage to identify your threat as early as possible. So with the paleo diet, what you have is a much higher fiber intake, and fiber is the things that they found that promotes a good bacteria. You have much lower grain intake, so your exposure to these pro-inflammatory foods is much lower. So your intestine actually has a chance to heal itself.
Yeah, I mean, like for the listeners who think paleo is all about meat, I'll probably eat, say, 20% of meat, and the rest was vegetables and nuts and things like that. So,
but do you think you increased your fiber intake when you look back?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There was an interesting program. It was on Catalyst last year about the intestinal health. I think it was August 15 or something.
Remember. Yeah.
And they were looking at, there was one particular guy, I think he's a sportsman, and he had like early borderline diabetes, young guy.
Yeah.
And they analysed his diet and realised that he was on the worst kind of diet for this, diabetes, which is an interleukin-6, one of those autoimmune type cytokine systems, and it was being you could tell that it was dysbiosis that was fueling it, because we know that those people, when you put the wrong gut bacteria in, they're going to get more inflammation, they're going to manifest it somehow. So he followed the dietitian's diet, which is basically to reduce all the processed foods as much as possible, which is low fiber, high density carbs, that kind of thing, increase the fiber, basically like a paleo. And he reversed all his abnormalities in 6 to 8 weeks. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And he said, amazing. I don't care. I hate this diet, but I'm not going to get diabetes, so I'm going to stay on it. Yeah, it's very interesting. So the gut health can be influenced by so many things, and we're just starting to work this out. I mean, even things like chlorine in our tap water.
Yeah.
Chlorine we use to, as an antiseptic. You use it to clean aircon filters and all these kind of things. And so hypochlorite is bleach, and so we're putting chlorine in. Is that affecting our gut bacteria when we're drinking tap water with chlorine in it? It's there to kill off the bugs, Cryptosporidium and Giardia.
Well, I mean, that is a good question. Is it?
Well, there are some people say that it does. I mean, it has to, because if chlorine can kill Cryptosporidium, and that's not a bug that goes down easily. And same with Giardia, that one isn't one that goes down easily. And the thing about water quality is, you know, a few years ago when Sydney had that issue with those two bugs, the way the media reported it was quite interesting, because it wasn't that the chlorination eradicated them, it just kept the numbers below a certain threshold level. So obviously the chlorine doesn't kill them off, it just sort of numbs them or reduces their numbers. So yeah, chlorine kills off bacteria and parasites and things. So
even in the concentrations that we have, like if it's, say, I don't know, what do they add it into our water supply, or is it just there? They do add it. I thought they added fluoride.
The formula for it when it goes through.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
But the point is, it must be enough to kill bacteria. Otherwise, we'd all be dying from Giardia and Cryptosporidium.
Okay. And don't they also say when you're having a hot shower with the chlorine in the water, your pores are opening up to the warmth, and then, you know, you're getting more of that chlorine than if you're drinking.
Yeah. Well, there's even worse aspect to that, because chlorine reacts when it's heated and creates compounds called tetrahalomethanes, which are all carcinogenic. The person who wrote the best about this was actually, can't remember his name now, about the Sydney water thing. He lives near the Hawkesbury River. John Archer.
So hold on, our showers are cancerous now?
Well,
mine's not, because I have a chlorine filter on the whole house.
The thing is to not have, I do too. I have chlorine. Is, you know, don't sit there under a really hot shower and inhale all the vapor. Yeah. You know what I mean? Do your 4-minute moderately warm shower and get out quickly.
I do cold showers myself. But,
there you go. You're right then.
Well, let's not go there, shall we? Okay.
Moving on.
They don't have hot water.
I mean, my family uses.
Yeah, you probably find if you have. Well, you know, there's a condition called heat-mediated urticaria, where heat sets off histamine in the skin, and funnily enough, there's actually cold water mediated urticaria as well. So you can't win. If cold water, you get it. If you hot water, you get it. You know,
I certainly get it with hot water for sure. Like that's no doubt. Cold water is fine. Like I don't get, like, I think maybe some people would get it with cold, but not everyone.
Perhaps you know, squad swimming 6 times a week and the chlorine exposure to that would be more of an issue. Yeah. And I know some of my patients who have eczema do suffer when they go back to swimming that amount.
I've had that question on my Facebook page a fair bit. What do you do with kids that are doing swimming lessons and you're trying to heal their gut and you know that the chlorine's no good for them? What can you do to help, you know, prevent them absorbing so much of it? And I did see something about people rubbing coconut oil on their skin before they went swimming and stuff, but I don't know if that helps.
Coconut oil or vitamin E as a barrier helps. But also taking vitamin E orally before swimming is also very helpful.
That's good
because different organs have different fire extinguishers when inflammation reactions occur. And vitamin E seems to be the favourite fire extinguisher for the skin. Like in really severe psoriasis, we might use quite large doses of vitamin E just for a short time, like 6,000 IU per day, because it does help to reduce the intensity of it. It's like the natural steroid for the skin.
Is it safe for children in just as a cream, like a barrier cream?
There's quite some good creams out there, vitamin E. Otherwise, a pharmacy can just simply make you a pure E and maybe mix it with a base that might be suitable. Depending on
because I know they mix it with like sorbeline and like petrochemicals.
Yeah, we don't want to use if you can avoid the petrochemicals. Like sorbeline, that's a good idea. But there are other ones like macadamia and a few other bases that are available that the chemists compounding chemists. So coming back to you, I think your destiny was set up very early in life, and with what you've done with the diet has allowed the I suppose the healing of the gut to some extent, but you'll still always react to gluten because that is something in the memory of the immune system that goes on forever, just like being vaccinated against something.
Okay.
So while you have leaky gut, and everybody does, remember that even after healing the gut, gluten will still cause leaky gut for up to 8 hours. So that you're open book, you're an open target.
Yeah. But I don't really care about it. Like, I've lost 28 kilos since I've gone on the diet, and my life has become so significantly so much better. And and I've got no reason to go back to it. But I'm just really interested from just to look at my history and understand what happened and where all this sort of how it came about. And
if you did your gene studies, you'd probably find that you didn't have the gene for celiac.
Right.
But clearly, the gluten was pro-inflammatory in your situation, just from an observational point of view.
Yeah. No, definitely. This is something that a lot of people ask, because there's been studies that came out about non-celiac gluten sensitivities, and I think last year or the year before, every couple of months a study comes out and says, no such a thing is real, and then another one says no such thing is real. It's not like you're either celiac or you're fine with gluten, and so obviously, Dr. T, we're saying that it is real, and that you don't have to be a celiac to actually get inflammatory responses from eating wheat, for instance. Is that?
And you can prove that by doing the IgG mediated test for gluten. There's other things about it as well. And a few years ago, I was giving a lecture at a symposium, and one of the doctors there was an American laboratory. He ran a laboratory in America, and he was talking about all the tests that are available for his laboratory. Now, when we do tests for gluten and gliadin, there's two of them. There's anti-endomycin antibodies and anti-gliadin antibodies. And his lab does 14 tests. And what he was trying to explain to us was that if those two tests are normal, don't necessarily think that the person's safe to eat gluten, because you haven't really looked thoroughly enough.
That's right.
It's very, and also we don't have, people talk about cross-reactivity between gluten and dairy, that if you react to gluten, you'll probably react to dairy. We don't have anti-casein antibodies available here in Australia, but they do in the US. And you do get both issues. Once one starts, you tend to find it in the other ones. And I think it's just because dairy often saunters along with meals of gluten. And so as the leaky gut begins, the casein fragments start to wander through as well, because they haven't digested either. So they just follow the gluten fragments, and that's why there seems to be a combination of the two. And that's the thing. Gluten opens you up to the problem, but it only happens if you haven't digested your food by that stage. If you've completely converted all your proteins to amino acids by the time you get to that, you shouldn't have a reaction, because those compounds are considered to be inert.
That really makes sense, because I know when I used to make my own spelt bread, and you have hot bread out of the oven, and I'd slather it with butter, and I'd do that for like 3 days in a row, and then I'd end up with this terrible reaction. And I always thought, it's the butter, it's the dairy, I can't handle it. But now that I've done this GAPS diet and worked through healing the gut, and I'm not having any gluten, I'm fine with butter, I'm fine with yogurt, I'm fine with cream. I had cream today. It doesn't bother me now, but I'm not having the gluten.
Perhaps you're more mindful of the amounts of those things too.
I am, but for like a whole year, I couldn't have even ghee.
Yeah.
And now I've got to the stage where I can have. Yeah, I don't push it though. I definitely take care.
Ghee with glee.
Pardon?
You can have ghee with glee.
Yes, I can. Woohoo! And I do have a lot of ghee now.
That's good. So then the next thing is the toxic metals. That we're saying that there's been an increase generally in toxic metals across the board, certainly in the patients I've seen over the years. And these toxic metals are also notorious for overstimulating the immune system. I have this amazing book called The Immunotoxicology of Toxic Metals, and in the sections of it, it's quite interesting the way it's been written, because obviously it's written mostly for like lab attendants and things like that.
Yeah, I was about to say, it doesn't sound
doesn't sound fascinating to me.
But basically, they said that if you want to create an anaphylactic animal, you inject them with nickel or mercury, and you've got, within a day, you've got an animal that will overreact to any trigger you.
Wow. Okay, that's scary, isn't it?
Yeah, and so when you look at nickel, you know, if a nickel is the commonest cause of contact dermatitis in Europe, that's why some people can't wear, you know, jewelry that has nickel in it. Even some the backs of watches, the casings, earrings and things like this.
Is it in braces for teeth?
There'll be some. It depends on the steel.
Okay, because I remember my daughter reacting the whole time she had braces. She had swollen gums, and they said they thought it was probably the metals in the braces.
There is actually a test for that. It's called a melisa, and dentists use it when they're, I suppose, auditioning prospective materials for dental work, and you can check for nickel, palladium, gold, silver. I was quite surprised that these metals that we consider to be inert, like gold and silver, are not that inert. Oh. It's a fallacy that they are. Some people don't react and some people do react to them. But nickel is definitely one that's been used to create anaphylactic models in mice and hamsters. And mercury is the other one. And the third one, which is aluminium. And these mercury and aluminium, you know, are used in vaccinations as immunostimulants. They're called adjuvants, and they're there deliberately to enhance the immune reaction to whatever is in there. So we know that they have that effect. So if you already have significant amounts of nickel in your body, or mercury or aluminium, and then you get challenged with a little bit more, you can imagine that some people might have problems dealing with that.
Yeah.
It's because they cause, you know, oxidative stress in the cells. So if you're really good at making a fire extinguishers like superoxide dismutase and glutathione, and that's genetically determined, then you'll be fine. But if you're not good at making those intracellular fire extinguishers, then that little bit of extra stress might just tick you off and send you, you know,
over the edge.
On to go. So the same with these food reactions. If you did have, well, the thing that turned up the most, because we do tissue mineral analyses, I was surprised how many of the kids who had peanut allergies had significant amounts of nickel in their hair samples. And it took me a while to figure it out, but legumes really concentrate nickel. They really take up nickel. And different vegetables, I mean, that's what gives them their flavour. Another example is root vegetables seem to concentrate uranium. And there's plenty of that in our soil. It's about 5 parts per million globally. So depending on what you're eating, you will get more of these metals. Nickel's used as a catalyst in making margarines. So, you know, it's in our, it's out there. It's in our food chain. So if you already have some, and then you're challenged with more, and we know that nickel is a significant immunostimulant, then perhaps that might explain the intensity of the reactions that we're seeing these days as these metals accrue and that seem to be higher in every generation. The triggers might be the same. It might be E102. It might be high salicylates from, you know, citrus and, you know, pineapple, whatever. But the reaction is more intense because the metals that are in the body already priming it to overreact.
So this is why you hear about toxic kids that, you know, they have to really work on helping them to detox. Can you give any tips for parents who are trying to help their kids detox from these metals? How do you do that?
First thing is to get some handle on how much they have. There are different ways of doing that. Kids are not as compliant with testing like, you know, chelation provocation tests or blood tests. So generally around Australia, people use hair analyses, which are not always the best way of gauging the toxic load in a person, because if you are genetically bad at making glutathione or another compound called metallothionein, you will not see much toxic metals on somebody's hair analysis because they can't actually get rid of it. It's stuck. So it may look like, oh, that looks fine. They don't have these toxic metals.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at them clinically and say, look, I really do think this person does have these metals, let's work on a system and let's improve their detoxification pathways, however you do that, then you'll see in subsequent hair analyses those levels go up. They appear to rise.
I see.
And the reason is that they're getting rid of them. And that is one of the exit points. The same if you measured 24-hour urinary collection or fecal collections. And again, it's because children it's very hard to get a child to collect their urine for 24 hours or their feces, you know. So the hair analysis is useful in that sense. And we know that some people, we will see more toxic metals coming out in their hair samples subsequently. And eventually when they run out of them, there's no reservoir, they drop.
Okay.
So if you get a handle on what their load is, that's a good starting point. Because then you've got to know when to stop. I mean, you know, everyone who does a detox has to know when to stop. And then there's quite a few things around, depending on the age of the child, their compliance. You know, there are ways of helping that. Most of the practitioners around Australia know those tips. But the most important thing is to get their gut right before you do this. Because if they have leaky gut, if you put a metal as small as mercury into the gut, it'll come straight back. And we know that if you don't repair that exit point, then you just recycle toxic metals round and around. So you want the exit to be one way, like a turnstile coming out of a swimming pool or, you know, a museum or something. Once you're out, you're out. You can't get back in.
Yeah.
So the gut, in that sense, is really important, and certain bacteria are more helpful when it comes to removing toxic metals. Certain bacteria are not so helpful because they're creating chronic dysbiosis and increased intestinal permeability. See, the medical term for that is intestinal permeability. They just don't like that term leaky gut. It just sounds too new agey.
Okay, intestinal.
But you can actually measure it scientifically. You can measure the pore size scientifically, and there's a normal range for intestinal permeability size. So you could do like a starting point to see how.
Is that a biopsy?
No, it's a urine test.
Oh.
It's a urine test. They give you a range of compounds that have different sizes in orally, and then they check in the urine. So if the small one gets through, you've got a little bit of leaky gut. If the large one gets through, you've got big leaky gut. It's a pretty harmless sort of test. So you can scale or determine the extent of that. You can do comprehensive stool digestive analyses where you look at a whole range of things from have the person got fragments of, you know, vegetables and meat in their feces? Are they digesting carbohydrate, protein, or fat? Do they have signs of inflammation in their intestine, looking at different inflammatory markers? You can identify whether the bacteria, the aerobes and anaerobes, are in balance with each other. Is there an overgrowth of one particular type? Is there an undergrowth of an important type? Is there a particular bug there that shouldn't be there? Do they have yeast? Do they have Helicobacter and parasites? So, you know, there are companies that do these comprehensive stool digestive analyses. That gives you an idea of what you're dealing with. And also perhaps the time frame of what it's going to take to improve it. So, yeah, getting the gut right is really important in the detoxification side of things, because if you get that right, it means that they will detox themselves. Yeah. And they'll do it forever. Well, until they become teenagers and eat badly.
Hey, my teenagers are eating well.
Yeah, I know. You're special.
That's because you homeschool them. You don't let them out of the house. You're always
they're out of the house right now.
Canteen, the dreaded school canteen. We don't get started on that one.
Yeah, true. I don't have to deal with that.
So you can see there's a really broad, this is a huge area, these food reactions. And some of them are like being in the wrong place at the wrong time, misadventure, something that's predisposed you. Then you've got the genetic aspect of it. Then you've got, you know, what created the gut ill health is on top of it, because generally those people with gut ill health have worse reactions than people with good gut health. Then the particular reactions could be that the fail-safe that protects you from them normally is not working, like the level of stomach acid. There's not been denaturing those things, pesticides, herbicides, flavors, colorings, enhancers, preservatives, that kind of thing. Then you've got the individual reactions. Once you set off the alarm, they'll be from mild to severe, depending on whether that person's immune system tends to overdo things anyway, genetically, which then will be amplified or suppressed by the presence of toxic metals and their gut health. So it isn't there is no silver bullet here.
Dr. T, with expectant mothers or women who are trying to have children, it sounds like it's a very important thing that they have things in check before the baby is conceived or, of course, given birth to. And
you're talking about preconception nutrition.
Yeah, and I think it's a big deal, especially for women who do have food allergies themselves. And a lot of the followers that we have their own food allergies, and they also have growing families, and they're having more children, and they're all interested in how do they minimize the risk for having a child with same or even more severe food allergies than the ones that the mothers have.
Yeah, they really have to sort out the reason why they have that problem. All those contributors that we've been talking about, the genetic side of it, what's the immunological mediation of it, what is the gut health like, whether they have toxic metals in their body, and those things. And the practitioners around, I have to say the naturopaths are better at this than the doctors, because they don't have to unlearn things. I had to unlearn a lot of my, ideas, assumptions, to really get a handle of this, because it's often reported in places where doctors don't look, and maybe in places that they wouldn't believe as well. Yeah, so you need someone like a holistic naturopathic. The people, sometimes the best way to find these people is to do it in reverse. So you might ring up a laboratory like Nutripath, for instance, and say, hey, I'm in, Sydney, and do you have any practitioners you can recommend that do this type of testing? Because we've got...
that's a good idea.
Or... if it's gene testing like Fit Genes, you ring them up and say, hey, I'm in Malanda, and, is there anyone who you've got a practitioner up here that does this?
That's genius.
Why haven't I ever thought of that?
Yeah.
So simple.
Yeah.
Because you're not devious like I am.
I'm learning.
Yeah, we'll do it in reverse.
For some reason, I think they'll be like, because how tightly policed Australia is, they'll say, sorry, this is highly confidential information, and we won't be letting No,
they're not. No, they're not ratting on anybody, because they're not breaking a Privacy Act.
Right. Okay. Great.
You're just simply saying, it's like saying, I've got
recommendation,
a
really,
BMW, and I live in the country. Which mechanics do those cars?
It's a recommendation.
Yeah. So they're happy to do that, because at the end of the day, they get more business, but they're also the labs do actually like to help people.
Yeah.
That's what I say to them. Look, if I can't find somebody, then get the laboratories to recommend a practitioner. Okay. Generally, they're happy to.
Yeah. We've talked for an hour, and do we still have lots of points on your list?
No, I've sort of covered quite a lot there. I just highlight a few things, about food, and sometimes it's not as simple as it's GMO or not GMO.
Yeah.
There are more things than.
What about GMO? What are your thoughts on that?
Now that you've brought it up.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing. It's hard because there's all sorts of I mean, I'll give you an example that, how best source of omega-3 is fish oil.
Mm.
Well, there's actually a plan to genetically modify the flaxseed plant so it made more omega-3.
Yeah.
There was, the pufferfish, the fugu, they're actually genetically creating clones of that fish that don't make the toxin.
Hmm.
So, there could be some good things about this and some bad things about this. I guess we don't know the long-term effects. There's so many. It's like even just the farming chemicals in Australia. There are 1,800 approved chemicals for use in Australia for farming.
Oh.
And you can use those. You don't have to actually supply safety data for them. If you want to delete one, you've got to have, a bus full of lawyers and millions of dollars and lots of court time to take one off the listing, but it's quite easy to
so we're talking about innocent until proven guilty kind of thing.
Yeah, it is kind of a bit like that. And sometimes cause and effect is really hard to find. A good example is DDT. It took about 30 years to realize that DDT was a carcinogen.
Yeah.
By that time, it's harder to track it down because people have moved. They might not remember that time they were sitting in the park and the council came through and fogged them, or that time they were helping their uncle spray, deodorant down the back fence with the pump thing, and they got all their back and legs all wet from that time. There's episodes where people have exposure to these things and they might have been short-lived or transient, and it's very hard to do cause and effect with chemicals. Yeah. And I think it's going to be the same with GMO. What worries me a little bit is that to create plants that are more resistant to pesticides and herbicides seems like a retrograde step that maybe we shouldn't be thinking about monoculture.
We're solving the wrong problem here.
Yeah.
And then you can go that translate to beef farming in the US, where they're giving them a diet which is completely unnatural to them, corn for a ruminant.
Yeah.
And the commonest cause of death there is acidosis because it's too, they can't handle it. And they should be grass farmers, not beef farmers. And if you let grass grow, you have all sorts of other things in it. You don't try to monopolize the biodiversity of it into one thing, then you don't have to use pesticides because you're not worrying. The diversity of it takes care of itself.
Yeah.
But so Dr. T, that means that people have to do some work rather than machines now. This is the problem. Like if you look at someone like Polyface Farms, where they have the most highly productive farm on the planet, and it's done through this kind of rotation system. It's super hard work. It's really people need to be really dedicated, and they want to actually, go and every day wake up before dawn and get all this work done. Whereas these days they've separated it neatly. You get the corn farmer, and he's using all the chemicals on the land and gets subsidies from the government, and they grow the GMO corn, and then they ship it off to these cows that are in feedlots. They don't even have to work hard. Machines can do most of the work for them. And I think people are just lazy these days, and they just want to maximize profit.
That's it, profit.
That corn subsidy underpins just such a huge part of the GNP of the US. That one decision to do that creates an industry that supports other industries that wouldn't be viable. It's a really difficult thing. I think the best way to counteract that is for other farmers to make a stand and start producing it through these rotatory systems where you've got cows and chickens, I think, isn't it? Those two, and then you've got
pigs.
Pigs, yeah.
There must be a way to automate that. I mean, if you can automate irrigation and that, you could automate some of those things as well.
Yeah, surely you can make things better. There's no doubt. We're highly creative beings, and surely we can. If we took all that money that we put into all the rubbish that we put it into, then we should be able to make these sustainable farming practices better. I mean, with the GMO thing, a lot of people go, it's just like what nature does, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because from the way I see it, it's like what you produce with genetic modification isn't something that could ever have been produced by nature. Like, I understand hybridization and selection, like when we select certain, breeds that are doing better, and we continue to select until those genetics are fit for purpose, but things where we get two different species and we get genes out of one and put it in the other, I mean, that to me sounds highly dangerous, and kind of like untestable in a short period of time. Like, we wouldn't be able to really make sense of how it would react in our bodies. Do you think that kind of stuff could be safe?
It depends on what they're doing and what's being done. I don't think that's what nature does.
No.
Nature deletes things that don't survive. I suppose they don't have a survival advantage, given natural things. So if we're testing something like a plant that takes more pesticides, that is not what nature would do.
No.
You can't use that argument.
No.
There was another point that you were mentioning. I remember when you were saying it.
Just now, or?
Yeah, just now.
I'm talking about maybe just hybridization or selection of the breeds that are fit for purpose. These are, and then as opposed to getting two different.
The meddling with it, I suppose, trying to create something that that man wants, but nature doesn't.
Mm.
And I think when we've done that, it hasn't always turned out so well. I'll give you a really good example. There was an experiment. You know how people complaining we don't have enough rain?
Yeah.
There's an experiment in Britain done, I think, in the 50s, where they used silver iodide and they seeded the clouds to get more rain, and they caused such a flood that killed 52 people.
Oh, wow.
So when we meddle with things like this, the outcome isn't always happy.
We don't know what the outcome will be.
Yeah, that's right. But probably the worst thing is that, when you've got drift, the organic farmers are well aware of this. That if your neighbour is using chemicals and you've got drift, that's wiped you out for 3 years, your production.
Yeah.
And the same with GMO, that if your produce is non-GMO and you've got drift from another farm, what do we do about that?
Oh, well, you get sued because
I was about to say that you get sued.
You have the right to grow these genetics that are proprietary. Ridiculous.
Perhaps what we should be doing is making sure that the labeling is consistent, so we know which foods have this. The same as we do with all the other nutritional information. Even like trans fatty acids, that's undergoing review here in Australia. In other countries, they make a big thing of it. Like in Scandinavia, the maximum trans fatty acids you can have in a food is 1%. So that's labelled so that people are aware and go, right, well, I choose not to eat that food that has trans fatty acids of higher amounts, or salt, or carbs, these kind of things. So maybe that's the best way to lobby, is so that, and then the consumer will decide.
Yeah.
I have a fear for the consumer. Like, I work in the corporate world and I see what people knowingly put into their systems.
That's true.
And I just feel like there needs to be some kind of sane intervention at a policy level where we do something.
One thing I hear is, well, the government wouldn't allow it if it wasn't okay. So that's people will just eat anything because the government allows it, so it must be okay.
They're there to protect us.
Yeah, that's right.
They are guardian angels. I think some people are very naive about.
Yeah, I think so.
Protections we have. If you really look deeply at the sort of things we should be protected from, like mercury in fish.
Yes.
Mercury amalgam fillings, all of these things. There's a regulator for them. But many of them are privatized.
Yeah.
So which means that they're not that accountable.
No. Dr. T, so your book has a lot of this information in it about what you spoke about with food allergies and testing and all that?
No, the inflammation book doesn't really have much about that. Really, just the genetics of the inflammation, the gut health, and how inflammation, what the toxic metals do to the immune system.
But that would be the first step for people anyway in their path to recovery, is to look at.
Find out how bad the problem is, and there are ways to quantify that, so you're not guessing.
Yeah.
Either way, you're not underestimating it, and you're not overdoing it either. If you can be objective about the problem.
Yeah, fantastic.
So you do have in your book, I'll just mention this again for anyone who didn't hear the last podcast, that you do have in the book how to go about getting testing, don't you?
Yeah, it's a kind of a self-help page of what questions to ask, who to go asking them, what tests would you need to know your liabilities and assets in your health, things that you don't necessarily get routinely. Like so many patients are informed when they have blood tests and they're all normal, that everything's fine. It depends what tests you do. And you don't always get the information in the blood. Sometimes you have to look in strange places, like in the hair or in the feces or in the DNA of a person to get and very few doctors aren't used to investigating. They tend to under-investigate, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because of time.
Yeah.
And maybe fear of persecution by Medicare and people like that. So the health self-help page, a lot of that information can be done without a doctor.
Okay.
And there are some tests that you need to do, but quite a lot of naturopaths are able to write tests like the ESR and CRP and things like that using local labs. The patient will have to pay for them. But I'll tell you what, from July 1, they would anyway.
Okay.
Because they won't. I've heard that there's not going to be bulk billing for blood tests.
Okay.
So that's going to open the whole thing up, and I think there probably will be a drift away from medical practitioners who don't investigate after the patients ask them specifically.
So go get your test now before July.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Get it done.
They don't cost a lot of money, these tests like the anti-nuclear antibodies. They're not thousands of dollars like you pay in America. They're a few $100s.
Okay.
$200 or $300. It's not that sort of cost, even if you get them done privately. But the gene tests are like $450.
Big families. Yeah.
And the poo samples are $380, $400, those sorts of amounts. But the thing with gene tests, you only have to do them the once because they stay the same your whole life.
That's true.
That'd be a good anecdote, isn't it? Doctor, can I do my gene testing again after the therapy? I want to know if they're any better now.
That's a Dr. T joke.
That is a Dr. T joke.
Well, we better stop because we better not go too much longer. But so many interesting things there. Thank you so much.
We've probably created a whole another 10.
That's what I was going to say. Now we've got a heap more questions. This is like an endless cycle.
How complicated it is and how wide it is.
So complicated. Do you have any other books you'd recommend that would help people? I know you've got a few books. Shall I just send them to your website? That might be easiest. They can have a look at what books you've got.
Yeah.
What's your website called again?
Nutrition Review Service.
Nutrition Review Service. Okay. And I'll put the link in the article on the Wellness Couch page. There'll be a link.
In terms of books on allergies specifically, I'll have to have a think about that. The book that I sent you, the picture of, I find that's actually very interesting from the overview of reactions. Why does asparagus make your wee smell? I just thought that was such a good book, not looking at allergies or anything specific, but perhaps the fact that food and humans can have a happy union or an adversarial one.
Yeah.
I'll have a look. I mean,
Well, if you think of something that we know, and I can put the link in the article.
Yeah, okay, I'll think of some.
Okay, thank you.
Julie Udi's Additive Alert is actually a really good starter as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for your time. It's very
Thank you, Dr. T.
And if anyone does
Save
have any...
the world.
What was that?
We saved the world tonight.
Yes, we did save the world.
one podcast at a time.
One podcast. Hey, we should have that for our little, slogan: "Saving the world, one podcast at a time."
Exactly. Yeah, I like that.
Maybe that one can be yours when you start yours, Igor.
You have to. It's fascinating.
We've gotten you into podcasting now. You have to start your own.
we're happy to have you as often as you want, but I think you have a lot more to offer. Even you could probably churn out one a few a week. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a subject, and I think what I realised was that my training did not prepare me for this at all. Not even
the podcasting or this issue.
No, just solving problems in general. I think one of the hallmarks of a good practitioner is that they use all the skills that they have. They don't waste any information that they've learned. But, in terms of what you learned in medical school, I think that becomes smaller and smaller as a percentage of the skills as you work in your field. I don't know if other doctors would agree with that, but what I've read and understood since that time, I think has made me a better practitioner.
It sounds like it to us, Dr. T. Like the work that you're breaking down to everyone and sharing so freely is, absolutely amazing. And we've met so few doctors from the mainstream who are doing what you're doing and helping people the way that you are helping. So the more we have people like you, the luckier this country gets. And we're really thankful to have you on our podcast.
Yeah, we are.
Thank you. Well, I always try to keep the science in it so that it's validatable. There's a word called validatable.
Sounds good.
And defendable.
Yes.
Where is the science in this? What can we draw from it? How can that support what we're doing? And that's really, from my point of view, that's really important. I consider myself a scientist who treats people.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed it and you're finding it helpful, and you can post questions and comments on our Facebook pages. There's the Quirky Cooking chat group and the Quirky Cooking page. There's Fuad's page, the food blog. And I don't know where people can reach you, Igor. Can they reach you on your website?
Yeah, they can. They can send emails there. There's
probably you're flat out with with your practice, so you probably don't have a lot of time for answering questions. But maybe if they send us some questions, we can ask you for the next podcast.
It's probably better to put them on the forum. So if you have 10 people asking the same question,
that's it. Yeah.
So
we'll definitely collect. We'll definitely have a question and answer session with you. I'm sure we've got a few topics we would like to cover first before we get into Q&A because there are many things more in depth. Joe, before we go, would you want to tell us a little bit about the upcoming GAPS program that you're doing and just tell our listeners?
Okay, so a lot of people have asked how I'm going with the gut health program. Still getting there, finishing off the ebooks. Won't be long, another couple of weeks, maybe a month at the most. I'm hoping it will be less than that though. So stay tuned. It's basically to help people with learning to cook good, healthy meals to improve gut health. So there's cooking videos, 6 ebooks with recipes and meal plans for 6 weeks. So there'll be lots of help there for those of you who just need that practical, down-to-earth, everyday help with changing your diet. So coming soon. Just stay connected on Facebook and my newsletter, and you'll find out any news on that.
And for those of you who don't know, Joe and I are in the process of writing our paleo cookbook together, which is called Quirky Paleo. And hopefully we're getting that out in November, and stay tuned for that. Hopefully very soon we'll start sharing things like the cover design and talking about what's happening.
Yes.
From my side, I'm actually dedicating myself to the book in about a week from now. Well, actually, by the time this podcast comes out, I would already be a caveman in practice. So basically what I'm doing is I'm leaving the corporate world and just going to be focusing on the cookbook, and I'll be living a much more Paleolithic lifestyle. So I'll have a lot of time in nature, and my aim for the year is to write a book and also overcome a childhood fear of climbing trees. So I'll be doing that this year. So stay tuned, and we'll let you know how that's going.
Good fun. Awesome. Okay, we'll come back in 2 weeks and we'll chat again. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.